That's all you need. All you need to be successful, not just in film, in life. All you need to do is hold on.
Welcome to the Pantheon Parenthetical. My name is Lance Ash. I was a Cub Scout when I was little. It wasn't very fun because my mother was the Cub den mother. And she treated me like she did at home. So, as if I was an annoyance or whatever. So it wasn't a very fun situation. Therefore, a couple of years later, when they started a Boy Scout troop in our town, I was not very enthusiastic about it. But pressure was brought to bear on me to join because I was the oldest boy in town, and supposedly the other boys wouldn't join unless I did because they looked up to me, which was a total fabrication. At any rate, I did wind up joining, and the first indication that it wasn't going to be all that the first indication I had that it was going to be a bad situation was the choice of uniform. Apparently there is no nationwide standard. It's left up to the individual troop or whatever it is, patrol. And the hat that the scout leader chose was the red beret, which I found to be silly. There were other options which I preferred, but we will get to that later. I hired a camel to carry me down to the floor of the canyon. It was my intention to perform the ritual of acceptance at the various burial sites along the route of descent. These burial sites were niches cut into the rock along the pathway. Each niche contained at least one mummy surrounded by artifacts, mainly pottery. These mummies had been celebrities of some sort during their lives. The nature of their celebrity and achievements, accomplishments, and so forth were to be found painted in symbols along the outside of the pots adjacent to their now mummified bodies. As the camel and I walked along, or loped along, we discussed many things. For example, we debated whether or not Rick Ocasek's embrace of new wave fashion reflected his own aesthetic leanings, or was it merely a marketing ploy? That is to say, by extension, were the cars themselves progenitors or originators of new wave fashion design, or were they merely jumping on the bandwagon, following a trend? There were a dozen of these burial sites. At each one I stopped and performed the ritual of acceptance, which was essentially my reciting a poem, which I will not repeat here, performing a series of hand gestures, and then dropping a ceremonial token into one of the pots next to the mummy. When I reached the canyon floor, I felt such relief, such a lightening of my existential burden that in a celebratory mood, I purchased 3 sombreros from one of the vendors to be found down there. I intended to present these to the camel, one for each of his humps and one for his head. He accepted the ones for his humps, but shook his head at the one for his head. He told me he preferred a forage cap. And thus we find ourselves at the end of another episode. So, thank you very much for listening.